All right, so we've made it to the last week of this study, and I know in speaking with many of you, it's been rich. Different portions of the study have been valuable and helpful for things that we all face together in life together as a husband and wife, and in raising children, and all of those wonderful things that come with their own complexities and challenges. And before we dive into our final chapter this afternoon, I wanted to share one bit of news with you. I'm about 90% sure, so don't hold me to this as an absolute, but I'm about 90% sure that our study for the fall will be the book of 1 John. So I thought that might be exciting to know. Where are we going next? What are we going to do? So between now and then, it's my intention to actually write another study guide for 1 John and provide a bit of commentary. It won't be exhaustive, but covering each of the units of the book and helping us to reflect on its meaning and application to our lives. And that's going to be a lot of work, as it always is, but it's good work, and so please pray for me, pray for the Lord to help me be effective in that, and also that obviously not just to get it done, but for it to be meaningful. Finishing a book is not anything helpful, but actually writing something that ministers to God's people and helps them know the Lord and walk with Him, that's worth doing. So pray that would be the end that God would bring out of that study. All right, so let's dive in, page 57 of our study guide, and I'll read through the introduction as we look at this final chapter. And then this chapter really is going to help us think about the long term, what's going to sustain us through the highs and the lows of life together in marriage. Let me start with this quote from page 197. When two lives in marriage lift the Son of God in honor, similar dynamics occur. The higher we lift Him, the closer together we grow. By honoring Him, our hearts are changed. Our priorities come more in line with His purposes. Our selfishness withers, and our forgiveness grows. We begin to tolerate each other's weaknesses more because we recognize our need for Christ's sufficiency in our own weaknesses. Our mutual understanding of each other deepens because we are each becoming more like Christ for His glory and for our spouse's sake. The simple point in that quote is that it is a marriage in which each spouse is striving to honor Christ, that marriage is able to flourish. Even when you face difficulties, you're able to work through them and come out the other side of those quote-unquote valleys of darkness, to use that biblical metaphor, because you're keeping your eyes fixed on the Lord. And that's the big thing we're going to be talking about today, but let me press on this page. This final chapter is focused on explaining the fundamental truths that will enable husbands and wives to maintain their commitment before God to love one another until death do we part. The goal is to help you and I foster a lifelong union of Christ-like love, for it should be our spouse. If you're a grammatical person, you'll notice that I accidentally said that you and I are going to foster a love for your spouse, which is not quite the same. Each of our own spouses. I noticed that this afternoon, and I thought, ooh, that's not very good. For many people, this will immediately sound idealistic. This idea that we can actually foster a lifelong union of love, and it can be a joyful thing. For many people, that sounds idealistic. Wounded hearts will argue, you don't understand what my spouse is like, or how hard I have tried, or what they have put me through. You don't know what it is like to live with this person day after day. To all those objections and the many others which could be raised, I humbly reply with this immovable truth. You are correct. You and I are not able to save, maintain, or heal our marriages, but God is. An enormous number of marriages in our day either end in bitter divorce, or they sullenly slink along in some kind of hollow toleration of one another, long after the genuine love has been allowed to fade. Beloved, this does not have to be your story, or If it already has become your story, it is time to turn the page and ask God to help you and your spouse start a new chapter. The opening illustration about the ethnolinguist is intended to bring to light one simple truth. Talk is cheap. This is not in any way to say that the communication of loving and romantic words is to be forsaken. Marriages need these words of affirmation and affection in order to thrive. The point, rather, is that we must tell our spouse we love them not only with our lips, but also with the self-sacrificing service of our daily lives. As the author noted, those whose love succeeds depends on actions, not words. And that brings us to our questions today. And the first thing that I asked us to do was to look at a passage from 1 John, coincidence there, 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. And if you would, take out your Bible and let's turn there for a minute and read through those verses. 1 John 3, 16 through 18. And here's what they say. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. I asked you, how is this passage a helpful model for the way God has called you to fulfill your calling in marriage? And before you answer, I want to remind you of something that I have said multiple times throughout this study. Being a faithful Christian spouse is learning to be a good Christian, but to your spouse. In other words, so often we think, oh yeah, I have to go to a marriage passage of the Bible to learn how to be a good spouse. Well, the marriage passages of the Bible are very helpful, but actually all of the passages of the Bible that are teaching you how to live a holy life that mimics the love of God and abides in good obedience to God's commandments, all of those passages have a tremendous amount to offer if we actually learn from them and apply them to the context of the relationships of our lives. This is a passage that most people would not think of immediately as having something to do with marriage. But isn't it very helpful? How so? What does this passage helpfully teach us about marriage and how we should love one another? What would you point out? Yes. Yes. Yeah, so what if God never fulfilled his promise to actually send his son and to lay down his life for us? What if he just said, yeah, I'll get to that someday. Don't worry, guys, I got it. But he never actually came. It kind of takes the wind out of Amazing Grace, doesn't it? You see how it actually deflates all of Christianity if that were the case, if all it was empty talk. How else might we think about this? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and I like the order that you put that in. First, it teaches us to follow Christ, because that's the whole passage here is predicated on what Jesus has done. By this, we know what love is. Well, by what? By what Jesus has done for us. And out of discovering and learning of what Jesus has done for us, we then are able to be moved towards self-sacrificing actions that meet our spouse's needs and desires in a similar way. And I think it's interesting, in the middle of this passage, verse 17, but if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Now, I want to just drive this home a little bit for a second. Think about all those times that you're at home and you see a need of something that needs done for the family, and you make the decision in your heart to leave it for your spouse. You see it, you could help, it would be within the realm of reasonability for you to take that on, but instead you close your heart and say, I'm going to let somebody else bear that load. Now, I'm not talking about the reasonable division of labor in the home where you already have kind of an agreement on, hey, you're going to take care of these things and I'll take care of those things. I'm talking about those times when selfishness shows its face and we start going, the toilet was clogged? I had no idea. Yes, I did, but I didn't feel like plunging it for the 10th time this month or whatever it is. And 10 times a month is a bit much. If you're having some problems, we might need to talk, but you understand the point, right? The point is there are lots of times in life where we actually face this in the fabric of real life. Same thing with our kids, not just our spouse. There's times where we know something our children might need. But have you ever just been too tired and you kind of find yourself going, yeah, I'm not going to get up. I'm just going to let it go. And so we face this all the time. And the question that presses us here, and the model we're given, is that true love is not just talk. It's not just promises. It's not just words. It's sacrificial actions. And you can't just say it's actions. You have to say it's sacrificial actions. Because the actions that are in view here are actions that come with cost to the one who's doing them, aren't they? Isn't that the model of Jesus? His death on the cross was not cheap. It was not something where he's like, hey, no skin off my back. It literally was. Jesus was his love was sacrificial. He gave of himself. He gave up himself for the good of others. And that is what this passage is driving home for us in the way that we relate to other people in general. But as we think of it today, particularly, we're thinking about this in the context of marriage. Sacrificial love not only makes promises, but walks them out in the fabric of the real lives we live. Now, I want to take this one step further. Think about this verse 18. Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. Go back to your wedding day and remember the vows that you took. There was the talk, there was the word. Are the actions following? You understand what I'm saying here? It was easy to stand all prettied up on that day and to make those promises in word. But this passage is saying, yes, and now it's time to make good on those in the midst of the real things of everyday life. You actually have to walk it out in a real way. Okay, next bullet point here is, what happens to a relationship where a person loves with words and tongue, but not with actions and truth? What are some things that happen within that relationship? I'll go first. Bitterness grows. Bitterness definitely grows up in that relationship. Why? Because now you're having unmet expectations. If you hear a promise from someone and they don't keep it, how does that feel? Terrible, right? And if you stack a few of those up, what do you start to have? Bitterness forming, right? And that can go both ways in marriage. It's not just a one-sided thing. Sometimes both people are doing that to each other. What else happens in those relationships? Yes, resentment. I think that's a very important word. Yes. I wrote, trust erodes. Why? Well, because you're not keeping your word. You could be very nice about not keeping your word. You could be really polite and say, oh, yeah, I love you so much, honey. I'll do this for you and that for you and everything. Isn't it great? But if you're not actually doing those things in the real daily grind, that person starts to lose trust. Resentment starts to form. What are some other things that come to mind? I'll add communication breaks down, which is related, but it's a little different. Yes, distance, right? You want to elaborate at all on that, Kenna? Yeah. Yeah, it becomes something more platonic, right? Also, intimacy evaporates. Do you know that relational intimacy cannot exist where trust is lacking? I don't know if you knew that, but it is impossible. It is impossible to have real relational intimacy where you do not have trust. Trust is fundamental to intimacy. And so when you have people who are loving in talk, but not in action, and these kinds of things start to form, the inevitable result is that your intimacy evaporates. And I'm not talking about physical intimacy. That certainly is sometimes a byproduct, but that can go on for a long time as a strictly physical action. I'm talking about the kind of love intimacy that is like the concrete of a real healthy marriage. It evaporates without these kind of things. Question 2, on page 190, a woman captured the painful progression of her marriage relationship when she said, and these are very bitter words, but I think they're important for us to take some time to think on. She said, "When I was 21, I cried when my husband said goodbye to go on a business trip because I was so miserable when he was gone. When I was 24, I cried when I heard him say hello because I was so miserable when he was home. Before we were both 30, I stopped crying and he stopped saying hello or goodbye because I no longer cared whether he was home or gone." Now, give me a moment to erase this. I asked you to identify the progression of that statement from that woman. Identify the different categories of progression here and somehow define them a little bit. For the sake of simplicity, I'll give you the categories that I use, not that they're any better, but to give us something, and then we can talk about each of them. First, you could say that they experienced devotion to one another. Later, they experienced disillusionment. And ultimately, they experienced disinterest. Devotion at first, that's the vows are fresh, right? Wedding day's not so far behind. The beautiful pictures are on the wall. The promises seem to be echoing still. And it seems like, boy, this is going to be great. And then the talk and the promises aren't kept. And the result, articulated by this woman, is that the relationship began to break down until it reached a stage of disillusionment where all this good desire, all the things that they were joyful about in marriage started to go away. And all they could see was their problems. And when you don't do something about this, when you are okay with this, when you let this go on, it will never stay here. It will always have a tendency to want to progress further into disinterest. And these words, toward the end of the quote, "Before we were both 30, I stopped crying, and he stopped saying hello or goodbye because I no longer cared whether he was home or gone." Now, I want to ask you, how does a marriage end up in a state like this? There's lots of answers we could give, but what are some that come to mind for you? Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Lack of effort. And he also added lack of effort in dealing with it earlier, which I won't write up, but I think that's an important aspect of that too, is nipping it in the bud, right? Kind of, so to speak. What else?
If you don't feed something, it eventually dies. But if you do feed something, it grows. So it actually gets better than it was.
Yeah. So would you maybe put starvation? Starving the relational intimacy. You're not feeding the relationship, so to speak. What about wrong priorities? Wrong priorities lead here, don't they? You end up saying yes to the things that you shouldn't have said yes to, and by saying yes to those things, you end up having to say no to things you should have said yes to. And that happens to all of us at different points. We can get all mixed up in the pressures of life and in the desires that we have in life. And that can lead to these things too. Any other things come to mind for you? Yeah. Too much self. I'm not here, I'll just be blunt. I think that husbands and wives should have their finances together, not separate. You may disagree with that. I'm not saying that's thus saith the Lord. I'm just telling you that's what I think. But the point of me saying that is that I know of many marriages where things like that are not happening. And that's not the only thing. What I mean is that their whole lives are still really separate. There's still too much self. This is my stuff. This is my house, or this is my car, or this is my bank account over here, and this is my thing over there, and my thing over here. And really, you have two individuals trying to pretend to be one in marriage, but they're not actually living like they're one. And that never works out well. It may go on for a bit, seem fine, but that kind of self-interested, individualistic mindset is very, very prevalent in a lot of people's lives, and it causes so much trouble in marriages. Again, I'm not saying that's a thus saith the Lord. I want to make sure that's clear so nobody leaves here and says, how could he say that? Well, I'm just telling you that I think that's a really good thing. You do not have to agree with me on it, but what I'm sharing with you is that self can get in the way of relational intimacy and health. Any other things that come to mind here? Yes. How so? Just the very nature of them, or? Yes. Very well said, Pam. That was fantastic. Very important. What do you do if a husband and wife have different philosophies of parenting or of how to parent in a particular situation? I'll tell you what you don't do is compete with each other or try to work around each other or work behind each other. That will erode your relational intimacy and set a terrible model for your children. Not only are you disrupting your own marriage and the stability of your own family, but you are eroding the foundation of your children's future marriage. Rather, it's okay that parents may not always agree on how to handle everything. That's pretty normal. My wife and I certainly do not always see everything the exact same way. In fact, it's somewhat frequently that she sees something one way and I see it another, and we're kind of going, okay, I guess we got some work to do. So what do you do with that? Well, in an ideal world, we're humble enough to talk to each other about it very peacefully and to listen well to each other so that we can understand one another's perspective and then agree on a plan. That plan may not be exactly what I think. It may not be exactly what she thinks, but we're going to unite ourselves around something together, and we're going to stick to that course for the sake of our kids so that we can provide, as Pam said, a united front in how we're loving them and trying to care for them. Does that make sense? Very important. All right, so the next bullet point I have here it's a very personal one, and so I don't know that we'll have a ton of conversation, but I really hope that we reflect on it. Perhaps not to the same degree, meaning not to the same degree as the woman articulated in the quote above, but has something like this happened to your marriage? This beginning with devotion, entering into disillusionment, and perhaps even getting so far as disinterest. Has something like this happened to your marriage? How have you allowed the throes of life to rob you of the sweetness of friendship with your spouse and of appreciation for them? I don't know if anyone wants to share here. I'd be happy for you to, but I understand it's a pretty personal question, so it may not be that everybody's ready to share that publicly. But it's an important thing, and I want to emphasize those two things: the sweetness of friendship with your spouse. Doing small gestures of love and of friendship with your spouse go a long, long way. Sometimes it's really small things that can make a big difference when you're in the midst of the throes of life. Somebody, you wake up early and you make coffee for your spouse or something like that. Or I'll tell you what happened. So my 15th anniversary was it was the 9th of this month. And do you know what we did for our anniversary? Nothing. You know why? Because we just had a baby and our hands are full. Wasn't really in the cards. But do you know what we actually did? My wife and I both got up about an hour early on our anniversary, which was pretty early because our kids are early risers. We made coffee. I made a little kind of fancy coffee, fancier than we normally have, and we sat on the front porch uninterrupted for 45 minutes. And do you know what? That may not sound like that was all that much, but it was so sweet because we laughed together. We looked into each other's eyes. We weren't interrupted every other sentence by whatever we were discussing. Those little things have a huge impact, but they're easy to neglect, aren't they? It would have been easier to hit snooze that morning. It would have been easier not to make the fancy coffee or any of those things. It would have been easier to do something else. And my point is not, and I need what we're talking about just as much as anybody else. So don't hear me by giving that example trying to say that I'm doing it perfect. I'm nowhere near that. But I'm trying to give real examples from real life. And what we need is to make sure that we laugh together sometimes. That we just, hey, you know what? We might be stressed out of our minds about our finances right now, or the car breaking down again, or the child who's given us a whole bunch of fits, and we're just stressed out. And we need to deal with all that, right? But we also just need to hit pause sometimes, give each other a hug, and tell a joke. I really mean it. Just those simple gestures of investment into the relational intimacy are worth far more than we often give them credit for. And so I would encourage us to take those things seriously so that we don't end up on this death spiral, so to speak. All right. I have one more penetrating question, which I'm sure you're all eager to answer, at the bottom of page 58. What have you traded the health of your relationship with your spouse for? Stop and really think about that. What have you traded the health of your relationship with your spouse for? We have all, I think, done that at some point. Maybe not in the tremendous way, but I think we've all done that. We've had weeks or months where we have traded the health of our relationship with our spouse for something. And I'm just asking for us to be humble enough to list a few of those things together. And I will go first. And we'll see if I'm all alone out there on an island or if anybody will join me. I would say for me, and I won't take so much time to write it, but I would say that one of the things that I have done this many times on is approval of others. I've traded the health of my relationship with my wife in order to obtain or to try to obtain the approval of others. In particular, in ministry at times, it's really hard to know, when do I not take that phone call because I'm with my family right now? When do I tell someone in the hospital this week that I can't come visit them when right now they're in a critical place? Well, who am I going to serve today? Am I going to give my children the attention that they need? Or am I going to give that congregant the attention that they need? That's a hard thing to answer sometimes. And you know what? Sometimes I get it wrong. Sometimes I get it wrong on both sides. And so there are times where I have given too much. I've wanted the approval of other people. I've wanted them to think I'm a good pastor. in a way that was idolatrous, rather than being willing to say, you know what, they may not think I'm all that great of a pastor, but I know that I need to keep my priorities straight and do what honors the Lord, even if it doesn't make me look very good in other people's eyes. And so I've fallen there a number of times, and that has had an impact on my marriage. There are times I've come home from that mistake, and I can look in my wife's eyes, and I can see, buddy, you chose the wrong thing. My wife would be exasperated, looking like I've been handling all this by myself, and you should have been here. And I wasn't. So that's one example. What comes to mind for you? Yeah. Yeah, hobbies can be a big one. Thanks for sharing that, Greg. What else? What are some real life examples? Has anybody ever said yes to a promotion that they later realized wasn't a promotion? It was a demotion because it cost you something that you shouldn't have been willing to give up? Just me? Oh. That's a pretty real thing, right? I mean, there's often times where you might have a job opportunity and you really have to weigh, what's this going to cost me? Not what's it going to put in the bank. What's this going to cost? Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking that sometimes you engage in a certain task and you do have time left in the day for your spouse, but what you don't have is energy.
Mm-hmm.
So you just kind of rest and recover instead of putting effort into the relationship at that time because you're just exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
So that also is a misguided plan for your life.
Related to that, I would say like my independent time. Sometimes I just want to do what I want to do by myself.
Yeah, independence. Yeah, those are great. Those are great examples. And Tim, I want to piggyback on yours for a second. I have had that happen to me so many times where it was not that I didn't save the right amount of time for my family. I didn't maintain the right amount of energy necessary to make proper use of that time. I was too worn out, too exhausted, too distracted, or maybe even still too preoccupied by the stress of some other thing in my life that, yes, I was there, but I wasn't there. I was on the floor with my kids, but I wasn't really with them. They weren't really getting me. They were getting some shell of me while I was somewhere else in my thoughts. And so there's lots of things that can happen that way in our lives. And my point is not to say, we're all so bad for doing that. My point is to say, no, let's just be honest and say, hey, this happens. What are we going to do when it happens? What are we going to do about it when we see these things in our lives? Are we going to actually address them, or are we going to stay on, I erased it, but are we going to stay on that downward spiral from the original devotion to disillusionment to disinterest and accept a very unhealthy pattern in our marriages? All right, let's turn over to the next page, page 60. And here we're going to be thinking about how the gospel received by us personally becomes the gospel displayed in our relationships. Reading from the top of the page here, again, drawing on 1 John 3:16 through 18, the author draws out an important point from verse 18 when he says, the Apostle John tells us to love in truth as well as in deed. That truth involves more than dealing with one another in integrity. Each of us must also face a vital truth about ourselves. We are far less capable of selfless love than we dare to confess. What the apostle has told us to be in our marriages is beyond us. Have you felt that? Have you felt that reality of the Christian life, that God asks more of you, in fact, requires more of you than you are able to do out of your own strength? And so what should we do with that? Well, The calling to love our spouse with a selfless, sacrificial, and forgiving love is not to be understood as a call to rely on ourselves. On our own, you and I do not have the ability to love one another with this kind of love. This kind of love can only be given away to others by those who have first received it from Christ. So let us further consider Christ's love for us, and then we will see how his love for us empowers us to love our spouse, regardless of whether or not that spouse returns love to us. I asked you to underline key truths about God's love from this quote below from page 194. Let me just read the quote and then tell me some of the things you underlined. Here's the quote. In the sacrifice of his Son, our God reveals his selfless desire to bless his children. Our God gains nothing in the deal of providing his Son to take the penalty for our guilt. His love is more selfless than that of a mother nursing her baby. She gives of herself to the child who can do nothing for her. Our God has given his own life for us, even though we are as helpless as infants to benefit him. What are some things you underlined here that were thoughtful reflections on God's love? Yeah. Yes, that God's love is sacrificial. Very good. And not just sacrificial in a small way either, right? The sacrifice of his Son, his beloved Son. So a very costly, a very valuable sacrifice. What else? Yeah, isn't that a profound truth? For some reason, that truth, whenever I hear that, it just, I don't know, it just grips my soul and reminds me of how glorious and wonderful God is. There's literally nothing that I'm ever going to give to God that makes him gain anything. There's nothing I can do to add to God. And yet that God was willing to do everything for me. And I think that's an amazing truth to consider. And of course, we want to ultimately see the import of that truth into our marriages. But let's look a little more at some things maybe you underlined. What about toward the beginning? His selfless desire to bless his children. I wonder, in your marriage, are you thinking about how can I use my life, my time, my energy, and my talents to bless my spouse? Are you thinking that way ever? Of course, I don't think any of us are there all the time, but are there times where you actually stop and say, what could I do to build up, to love, to bless this person that I have committed myself to throughout my life? I think that'd be a good thing, and that would mimic the selfless love of God, where he desires to bless his children. Moving on to question 8, how does a proper recognition of the love which God has shown to us as guilty sinners enable us to show selfless love to our spouse despite their failures and guilt? How would you articulate that? How does our recognition of the way God has loved us translate into helping us love our spouse with that same kind of love? What would you say? Yeah. Yeah, could you guys hear that? And do you find that to be true in your Christian life? Like when you're deeply aware and humbled by your need for God's mercy, does that have an effect on the way you treat the people around you or no? I'm getting some nods, okay. We're loosening up. Yeah, to me it has a profound effect. A very profound effect. Can you imagine going, kind of picture what is that parable? The parable of the unforgiving servant. Remember that parable? The king forgives him of an exorbitant debt. And what does he do? He turns around and takes a guy by the throat who owed him, in comparison, a very small debt. The love he had received, the mercy he had received, somehow was not being translated into the relationships of his life. And that was completely backward, wasn't it? And what does this mean for us? Well, to put it simply, it means that as a Christian, you need to walk close to the Lord. You need to be soaking your soul in the truths of our faith, in the gospel of our faith, if you are going to then exude those things in your relationships with other people. It is when we are forgetful of our own wretchedness and God's mercy to us that we become stingy in extending that kind of selfless love to others. Does that make sense? And we start to get exacting, and those things, as we've already discussed, tear down the fabric of relationships. For the sake of time, let's skip question 9 and jump over to the top of page 61. Oh, did I skip a whole page? Oh my, let's go back there. Thank you. I turned too many pages. I was thinking when I just looked at the top of the other one, I was like, how did we get to the end so quick? Thank you very much, Tim. All right, so let's go backward, even though it's a bit out of order, but I don't think it'll make that much of a difference. According to the author, question 3, what secures true love if words cannot? So we talked about at the beginning how words are not enough by themselves. What is needed? Action, but let's put something before that, a particular type of action. So we've got action. What goes before it? Yes. You could say selfless. And I would also want to put sacrificial. Now, what's the difference between action and selfless and sacrificial action? Sometimes actions can be used manipulatively for selfish gain, can't they? Sometimes people do the right things to get something out of you for themselves. So actions alone are not quite the fulfillment of the call of the Christian, are they? Those actions need to be undertaken with selflessness and with a sacrificial mindset of actually benefiting and serving the one who we've been called to love. That's very important. Okay, the number 4, read the gray box titled Kathy's Thought on page 190 and 191. And then I asked, why is this simple story about a man making a medical appointment for his wife such a moving example to us? Do you remember the story? Good. Most of you do. A very quick synopsis in case you read it a while ago or something like that. There's an older man. He goes into a women's clinic where a lot of women are there to have mammograms and other things. It's not the kind of place that guys typically go. So he's already sticking out like a sore thumb, and he goes up to the window, and she says, hey, what can I do for you? It's kind of funny to see you here. And he says, well, I'm here for my wife. And the lady says, oh, are you picking her up? And he says, no, she has Alzheimer's, and also it seems that she may have breast cancer. And this man had come, he proceeds to tell them, he had come so that he could learn as much as he could about what it would be like for his wife when she came, so that he could go home and do everything in his power to prepare her for that trip, because with Alzheimer's, this was going to be a very difficult experience for her, a very scary thing. He was trying to do everything he could to comfort her, to make that as safe of an experience for her as he could. And of course, Kathy was sitting in the waiting room together with other ladies, and they were all just mesmerized by the love that this man was showing and to his wife. And so my question is, why is this simple story about a man making a medical appointment for his wife such a moving example to us? What was moving about this? Yeah. He cared that much for her. Yes. Well said. Yeah, that's well said. Will said he put himself in an uncomfortable and awkward situation for the sake of the one he loves. They had been married, I think, for some time. Based on the story, it seems that they were a little bit older in their years. And you know how many years ago? Well, he mentions actually in there, he says, I'm totally gonna misquote it because I haven't read it recently, but he says, I vowed to her many years ago that I would love her. And that's what I'm trying to do. I still love her, and I want to show her love. Now, you have to understand, and most of you do, if you've cared for someone in a condition like his wife was in, her ability to return love was probably severely limited at this point. Really, he probably wasn't able to get much out of the deal, so to speak. But that wasn't what he signed up for. He didn't say, I'll love you if you love me. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. He said, I will love you until death do we part. And he was making good on that. And I think that's why this story is so moving. It's because his love was not simply words. Those vows he had taken, he was making good on them. And not just during the prime of her life when he was still getting some benefit, but then in the decline of her life when she could give him nothing anymore. But he was still giving himself for her. And I think that's why that picture is so moving. And more than anything, it's moving not really because of the man, but because it reminds us of someone far greater than that man. Who does that remind us of? It reminds us of the love of our God. And that's the point I want to make out of this. What we see in this man's love for his wife is only the faintest inkling of what we should all see in the love of Jesus Christ for his church. And 1 John 3:16 through 18 exhorts us to true love for others. Love that manifests itself in sacrificing actions. But according to verse 16, the beginning of the text, where must we look if we are to learn how to love like this? And Kenna, you pointed this out earlier. Not that you have to answer now, but what does the beginning of that text tell us? Where should we fix our eyes if we want to know what love is? On Jesus. Now that's a simple softball Sunday school answer, but you cannot forget it. But we do, don't we? We start looking at all other kinds of things. We'll go read a bunch of secular books by secular psychologists on marriage before we actually stop and say, God, get the gospel in my heart so that I actually love my wife. Get the gospel in here. Fill my eyes with Jesus so that I learn to love when it hurts and when it's hard. None of that stuff is going to get past this truth unless you become gripped by the love of God for you in Christ. You will not have the capacity to love your spouse when the going gets tough. We have to learn to receive the gracious and forgiving love of God before we can learn to forgive and love our spouse. I asked you to make a strong list of the kinds of characteristics that that describe Jesus' love for his people. What are some of those things that you wrote down here? Unwavering, good word. What are some of the characteristics of Jesus' love for his people? Patient, well said. Faithful. All sufficient. I heard two. I heard unreserved. What was the other one? Provisional. Unreserved. Had to go back and check, didn't you? Provisional. Okay. What else? I know just what you mean. I don't know how to put it differently, though, so we're just going to put goes first. I know what you're getting at, though. He stands in front, right? He takes the brunt. Unrelenting. Unrelenting. You guys are getting all these big fancy words on me. Unconditional. What's that? That's true, and I appreciate it. This is actually, everybody's engaged now, so I'm glad we're doing this. What about forgiving? I think that's implied, but it's worth stating, isn't it? What about confronting? Doesn't Jesus love us with a love that's willing to confront us when we need it? But I wouldn't just say confronting. I would say it's confronting with a view to my good. Jesus is willing to come to me when I make mistakes, but he comes to me not to beat me up, but to actually minister to me and help me, to set me on the right path, to bring me to repentance. What are some others? I would also point out that Jesus' love for his people is unique to each person's needs. It's not a one-size-fits-all mechanical kind of love. Jesus takes into account each particular person. One verse where we see that is in John 15, I believe it's verse 2. We don't have to turn there now. But he talks about how he is the vine and we are the branches. And he talks about how God prunes each branch. And it's a really powerful picture in Scripture of God's particular personal care to make individual children of God fruitful. It's amazing. A very comforting truth about his love. Yes, Tim?
I was just thinking that we could also say that Jesus' love is rooted in the overarching purpose of God in the universe.
I'm going to need another side of the board here, Tim.
Such that it's not merely that it seems good to be patient at the time,
Yeah.
faithful at the time, forgiving at the time. It does ultimately serve that higher purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to the anecdote of the older man in the clinic, he rooted his action in the marriage vows, which we acknowledged would have been many years ago. And so he's demonstrating a profound awareness of his overall purpose in that relationship as
Mm-hmm.
husband and servant, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very difficult in life to constantly be aware in the moment of those big picture perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's well said. I think that's a profound point. I don't know that this captures it well, but I put eternally minded. In other words, Jesus doesn't just love us sort of on a whim, what's the moment feel like, but he's loving us toward a grand purpose, toward a grand end, and according to his covenant promises, which predate us significantly. So that's well said, very insightful. Yes. I'm going to sneak that one in here. Promise keeping. Isn't it cool? Whenever you start talking about God, you always have to start using like lots of hyphens. Have you noticed that? Because it's just, every time you use language to talk about God's goodness and glory, the wonder of who God is, we always find the limits of language. We go, I'm grasping here. I'm trying to reach into the heavenlies of how wonderful God is. I just think that's a cool thing to experience. So there's more we could list, and that would be a very good thing to do, but I want to, for the sake of time, look at the next part of the question, which is, those characteristics which you just wrote down, which you don't have to take all the ones that perhaps you personally wrote, you could take some of the ones we just discussed. These things are the very things which God is calling you to demonstrate in actions towards your spouse. Now, there is a difference. We are not God, but you understand what I mean by that. In human form, we are to now try to embody toward our spouse and toward all of our relationships appropriately the kind of love that God gives to us. And I asked you, which of these do you most need to ask God to help create in your heart and to work out in your life? We're going to save that question, for our group discussion. Okay, so when we break up in groups in just a few more minutes, this is the question we'll come back to and talk about together. And once everyone has shared, I'd love it if we could just pray for each other in our groups and pray, asking God, help us with this. Help us to love our spouse with your love in these different ways. All right, number 5, beginning with a quote here. Of course, God does not expect us to physically die for each other every day. We are, however, to die to self each day. The satisfaction of our own needs and desires cannot be the primary reason we enter nor continue in marriage. Such motives will never allow true love to flourish and endure. I want to comment on this quote briefly, particularly that part where it says, the satisfaction of our own needs and desires cannot be the primary reason we enter nor continue in marriage. For those who might haven't, so there's a couple of folks here who are not yet married, but even for those who are married, in your influence on other people who are perhaps hoping to get married someday, that's a conversation that needs to be had. When someone comes and says, I want to get married, don't be rude, but at some point, when it's appropriate, you might say, why? Why do you believe that this marriage would be a good thing for you and an honoring thing to the Lord? Again, not in a rude way or some sort of way to make them, uncomfortable, but in a thoughtful way to help them really begin well. Begin with their minds and hearts fixed on the right kinds of things, because I think for most of us, if we're honest, our sights were set probably far too low when we entered into marriage. We were not thinking very good biblical thoughts when we were married. Now, God has been merciful to us in that, and yet it's a good thing for us to learn and grow. I asked this question, and we'll see if anybody's brave here. Where is selfishness ruling your heart in your marriage relationship? What are specific ways that you need to repent and follow Christ's example by dying to self in the loving service of your spouse? I'll tell you one for me, and if others want to go, they can. With the addition of another child, that changes the dynamic of the home quite a bit, particularly not just because it's a child, but because this child's currently an infant and can do nothing for itself. It changes things a bit for a season. And it is, how do I put this? I needed to repent about a week and a half ago, of my expectations for how the home was going to go. Because I was expecting certain things to be at a certain level, but I wasn't doing anything, per se. I was doing something, but I wasn't doing what I ought to have been doing to see that they actually met that level. I was sort of saying, this is what needs to be, now get it done. And I wasn't actually saying it that way, but in effect, that was what was going on. And the reality is that the result was my wife was just not getting the support that she deserves from me. Now, she wasn't complaining, but God was working on my heart to help me realize, Tom, you have got to sacrifice more of your time. And so one thing that I needed to do recently was to repent of that and to say, okay, I didn't think I had any more time or energy to give here, but I'm going to have to. And so one thing that I started last week is that my two boys at home, we're getting up at 6 a.m., and I'm spending an hour and a half with them on their homeschool, covering, they have their time with the Lord first, and then we're doing math, and we're doing spelling and grammar, and then we're done by about 7:30 with those particular subjects. And do you know what that does for my wife? It frees up about 2.5 to 3 hours for her, because when she's doing it, she's got the two boys to take through, plus these kids over here who need this, and those ones over there, and this baby over here. And so it just naturally takes a lot longer, and it's very difficult for her, and honestly negatively impacts the boys because they sometimes don't get quite as much focus. So this was a way for me. I recently needed to go, you know what, Tom? You're expecting your wife to somehow handle all this while you're just like, yeah, guys, I'm going to get up early and have my quiet time all by myself and my coffee and this peaceful time, and just leaving it to her in a way that was just imbalanced. And so for me, I needed to see my own selfishness in that and go, Lord, I'm not leading like Christ, and I need to deal with that in my heart. So there's one example that actually ended up being a lot longer than I anticipated in the explanation, but there you have it. Any examples from your lives? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you're saying that you see some selfishness sort of coming along with you into those actions? Yeah, I can relate to that. Getting a little close to my heart there.
I think if people are like me, sometimes think of temporal things as so-called secular things. And so focusing on our own spiritual needs. And so you would still be able to say, well, we spent half an hour talking about the Bible, but maybe it was what I wanted to talk about or discuss deeply, and then the other's need is not satisfied spiritually.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And also, it can be basic things like not helping out with some of the chores around the house. Leaving things to pile up for one or the other spouse, or we could go down the list of those kind of things. But the point that I wanted to help us consider here is that we are called as Christians to love our spouse with a Christ-like love, and that Christ-like love means a self-sacrificing love. And that's a hard thing to do, which means we have a lot of opportunities to repent, a lot of opportunities to acknowledge our shortcomings, and a great opportunity for us to continually depend upon God to work in us and to change our hearts. Question 6. The author celebrated the love which his wife had shown to him during the writing of this book on page 192. He recounted a number of ways that she had shown selfless, sacrificial, and uncomplaining love to him, despite the fact that she was bearing the heavier load at home. In the space below, write down some of the ways Kathy demonstrated Christ-like love to her spouse during this season. What do you have here? We can kind of popcorn this one. Yeah, not complaining. That's big. So when you're complaining against your spouse, it will never help. Complaining towards your spouse is not going to lead to the flourishing of your marriage relationship. It's only going to chip away at it further. What are some others? Yeah, not keeping score. Very important. Very important. Also just being understanding, right? It kind of goes along with the complaining, but she wasn't thinking, well, you're over there and doing this. Instead, she was thinking, I'm happy to support you. I'm happy to do what's needed to enable you to go and do whatever it is that he was away doing. There was a joyfulness in her service. She wasn't resentful. She was willing to do more, quote unquote, more in that season than he was. She wasn't having pity parties. She was willing to give up her own desires and preferences for a season in order to give him some of those things for himself. And she was supportive of his goals. I wonder, for instance, and I'm not picking on wives here, this can go both ways, but when's the last time that you actually listened to something that your spouse was really interested in and committed to and talked about their goals, and how can I actually help you with that? How can I come alongside you and support you to enable you to reach those goals? And that goes both ways, but sometimes it ends up going one way in a marriage, doesn't it? It's all about the husband's goals, or it's all about the wife's goals, rather than them working together. All right, so let's press on to that page that I almost skipped ahead to too soon, that final page. And we just have a couple of things to look at here, but it's important that we do. Starting at the top of the page, someone will no doubt say, but you don't understand. I have tried everything, and I am just not getting any results. My spouse won't change. They won't invest. They don't care anymore. We've been talking about sacrificial love. We've been talking about working hard at marriage, and yet we need to acknowledge that that is the situation for some people, right? That is the situation at times. And I don't want anyone here today to feel like they're not heard in that reality or in that struggle. We are wanting to talk about some positive ways forward, but that doesn't mean we're not acknowledging that it can be extremely difficult at times as well. This quote that I just gave, this is a very difficult place for anyone to be. And what I'm about to say is not intended to downplay that struggle in the least. However, we must remember that our vows in marriage were not ultimately to our spouse or to ourselves, but to God. And we must remember that even in the darkest hours of life that we may be called to walk through, we never walk through them alone. God is with us and is using all that we face for our good and His glory. I asked you to explain what the author is trying to teach us in the quote here. When we vow to love and honor each other, we also make these promises before and to our God. This means that even when words and feelings between the two people fail to keep the marriage that God desires, we should not consider the marriage finished. Our promises to remain perpetually committed to each other are ultimately made to God. We live for another because we have committed ourselves to living for the God who requires it. We love another because we promised the God we love that we would. What is it the author is trying to teach us in these words? Yeah, that she said, my vows are to God. And while our relationships, let me erase this. We've talked about this before, but it's important that we maybe bring it up again. You know, our spouse's performance might look something like this, right? Or it might even look something like this. And so if our vow is to them, based on how well they're performing, what will our commitment to the marriage also look like? It will mimic this, right? Well, now here I'm kind of committed. Here I'm ready to get out. Kind of committed again. Kind of ready to get out. I'm really ready to get out down here because they're just not performing the way I want them to perform. That's an understandable thing. So please don't hear any coldness or heaviness in what I'm saying. It's understandable that we feel this way as sinful human beings. But that is the world's definition of love, not God's. And that is why Christian marriage is important. Marriage is not merely an institution of the government. It's not a tax bracket. It is a covenant before the living God. And God is the author of marriage. And when we make our vows to God, God is consistently perfect. And if my vow is to God and based in who God is, what will my commitment be then if it follows this path? I will have a steadfast commitment to loving my spouse, even when my spouse may be ebbing and flowing in all kinds of ways. Does that make sense? Now, I want to be very careful here. That's easy to say. Pardon my language, but that's hard as hell to live out. I mean, let's just be real. When you're in this, it is very hard. And what I would say to you is, don't try to face all this by yourself. Number one, draw near to God. And number two, draw near to some trusted Christians in your life who you can invite in and you can ask them, my heart doesn't want to love like this right now. It wants to love like this. Will you hold me accountable? Will you ask me, are you loving your wife? How have you loved your wife this week? Get somebody in your life who's going to challenge you to be who you promised God you would be, so that you're not just left to your own sinful heart in private with no one checking in. Does that make sense? It is hard, and I don't want anybody to feel like they can't be honest about that. But God is able to help us. And what I would tell you is that even though I am a very young pastor, already in my short time of walking with the Lord on this earth, I have seen many marriages absolutely turned around and revived by God's grace. Marriages that people would have thought, this is never going to make it. But in God's kindness, one or both of those spouses humbled themselves before the Lord, and they said, my vows were to God, not ultimately to my spouse. And by faith, I'm going to strive to be faithful to my God. And the result, God was pleased in many of those cases to revive those marriages and to bring healing in tremendous ways. So we'll close there for tonight, and we'll break up into groups for our last bit of time. I apologize, I've gone a little longer than I normally do. I like to break up a little sooner than this, but since it's our last study, if you don't like it, you don't have to come back next week. But remember, the question that we're covering, I accidentally closed my book here. The question is on page, I believe it's page 59, and it's the third bullet point under number 4, which is, which of these do you most need to ask God to help create in your heart and to work out in your life? And these being those characteristics of God's love for his people. What about God's love do you need God to help you begin to exhibit more in your marriage? All right? Let's break up into groups, and then I'll close us up probably just after 6 this evening since I started us a bit late.